The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
Welcome to the Endurance Experience Podcast. I'm Tony Rich. This is the Season 6 finale of the Endurance Experience. And in this episode, I wanted to revisit the discussion of fairness and inclusion in sport. This was a widely discussed and debated topic throughout the recently concluded Paris Olympics and Paralympics. It's been a little under a year now since we heard from, in her memoir, the athlete Caster Semenya. She released a book in her own words titled The Race to Be Myself. And I think it would be appropriate for me to read a passage from her book in order to tee up this podcast. This is from her chapter 11, which she titles The Troubles Begin. I went to the hospital alone. A nurse met me in the waiting area and escorted me to a patient room. There were 2 chairs and an examining table with what I now know are stirrups. I'd never seen those before. She directed me to a chair. Soon, an older black man entered and introduced himself as a Dr. Oscar Shimani, a gynecologist. Yes? Hello, what's this? I pointed to the table. I'm here for a doping test, doctor. Dr. Shimani sat in the chair across from me. He looked at me and brought his thumb and forefinger up to the bridge of his nose. No, Miss Semenya, did these people not tell you what you are here for? You are not here for a doping test. Dr. Shimani, unlike Dr. Lane, didn't talk around the truth. Dr. Lane was previously the psychologist that came to see her. He came straight out and leveled with me. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. It is my duty as a doctor to do no harm. I've been asked to perform a gender test on you. It is your right to refuse to take this test. I knew what the word gender meant, and so I wasn't bothered. I felt something more like annoyance. Ah, this thing again. Okay, then what's the problem? Do the gender test, doctor. Let's not waste time. I have a plane to catch, a gold medal to win. Miss Semenya, this isn't as easy as you think. I'm required to do a full examination. Okay, then do it, I said. What do you want from me? You need to see my things? I sat further back in the chair and crossed my arms. Dr. Shimani took off his glasses. Miss Semenya, are you a boy? I laughed. I'd been accused of this before. I have nothing to hide, Doc. I'm a girl. I have only girl parts. Do you have a wife? You know what a vagina looks like? If you know what a vagina looks like, that's what you're going to see here. Then I undressed, put on a hospital gown, laid on the examining table, and spread my legs for the first time in my life to another human being. Dr. Shimani looked at my privates. He never touched or asked me any questions during the exam. I couldn't tell from the expression on his face what he was thinking. At some point, I felt the need to say something. And don't try anything funny with me, Doc. I may be a girl, but I will beat you down like a man. Dr. Shimani chuckled. He brought out a sonogram wand and placed it on my lower belly. He drew blood. and then the exam was over. Once he was finished, I got dressed, and we spoke as two humans, not as doctor and patient. I could tell that he was a good man. Castor, I am going to tell you the truth here. You are not built like most other women. I know you already know that, but these people are looking for a specific issue, a hormone in your blood called testosterone. Both men and women have this hormone, but you may have a higher level of it than the sports people allow for your gender. I am sorry. I think the results will show this is the situation with you, Castor. As a fellow African, I have to tell you, I think the chances of you running in the world championships are very low. I just sat there and listened. He went on to mention chromosomes and X's and Y's and how sometimes there are certain functions that are blocked in the body when there is a hormonal imbalance. The words and science were beyond me at the time. I never heard these terms before, and I didn't hold them in my mind. Still, I understood he was saying that even if I was born a girl, I was different because of this hormone. He was right. I didn't have the curves African women are famous for, and I still hadn't gotten a period. Just for context, she was 18 years old at the time of this realization. But those things didn't matter to me. I dealt in practicalities. There were plenty of female athletes whose bodies resembled mine and who, like me, had not once had a period. They were there with me at the university and in the running circuits. I'd sometimes overhear their conversations. If I had a quote-unquote condition, then I had it. It didn't change the fact that I sat down to pee like every other girl. Once he finished, I spoke. It is God's will, Doc. It's a part of life. This thing you say I may have, if I have it, God gave it to me. I've been able to live my life and be successful with it. I don't see why this would be a problem now. I've been running in the system this whole time. All I know is I am a girl. I don't have a penis. You saw that with your own eyes. That's all I know. You can finish your tests. If they say I can't run, then I can't run. But they haven't stopped me yet. Thank you for your time. End of passage. I do highly recommend you read her book. We finally heard from her in her words about her life, the discovery of the condition, as you heard, at age 18. That condition being 5-alpha reductase deficiency, what is known as a DSD, or a disorder or difference in sexual development. And as you've heard, someone like Castor Semenya can make it through to adulthood, and they and their parents may not be aware that they possess the DSD, which may include one characteristic of pubertal development with testosterone in the male typical range. And as you know, the testosterone ranges between males and females are so vast, they don't even overlap. In sport, we have great empathy for these athletes. As you heard it from Castor Semenya, they are training hard, competing hard, living their life in their own body. Yet, to no fault of their own, they become the center in a debate between inclusion and fairness in sport. You may recall that I had 2 podcasts touching on this topic. The episode 2 with the head of the Human Performance Lab at Brandeis, a PhD, Maria DeBoof-Myra, and my episode 39 with Joanna Harper, who's a scientist and a trans athlete herself, and advisor to the IOC. For this season finale podcast, I wanted to find yet another expert who is going to speak with a science-centered expertise, and my guest did not disappoint. She is Professor Kerry McGawley. She's a PhD and a sports scientist in the Mid-Sweden University Swedish Winter Sports Research Center in the Department of Health Sciences. She has a broad research agenda, including the female athlete and menstrual cycle phases and implications on performance, including menstruation, health, literacy. She also has published research in athletes' health to underpin performances, and arm cycling, mechanical and physiological effects, among other research projects. Her doctoral thesis was on the application of the critical power construct to endurance exercise, and she has a vast library of journal articles, published work, and citations. And if you want to be even more impressed, she herself has been recently two-time age group world champion in triathlon. I have linked her complete bio in the show notes. We have a conversation about DSD athletes and the implications to the question of fairness in sport. We talk about the women's category of sport and how it's protected, and other issues related to the protection of the women's category of sport, including the governing bodies dealing with the issue of trans athletes competing in the women's category. Professor McGawley co-authored a paper with other scientists, which was a response to a position paper on the IOC's framework. She talks about that paper and some of the findings. You can also find a link to that paper in the show notes. We talk about the common rebuttal to the question of unfair advantage, namely what I've referred to as the Phelps principle, i.e., why do we seem to only care about unfair advantages in certain cases, but not cases like Michael Phelps or Usain Bolt? Professor McGawley gives her critique of that rebuttal. Then we switch gears and talk about key considerations that athletes and coaches should be aware of regarding the menstrual cycle and the implications on female athletes for training, racing, and performance. I felt that it was absolutely necessary to get Professor McGawley's expertise on that subject. This was a great conversation. A quick note, we had some audio instability somewhere around the first 25 minutes or so, and it passes, so bear with me on that. And I would just invite people who feel like they have this issue all figured out, approach the conversation with an emotionally detached posture, regardless of where you think you may stand. As we have science and evidence-based conversations, you just may come out of the other end learning a little something. More to say in my afterword. And now I bring you Professor Kerry McGawley. All right, I am on with Professor Kerry McGawley. Thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.
So I've known of you for some time, and I know you have a background as a sports scientist and an expertise in the female athlete. And like myself, you're a coach of athletes and also a pretty stellar athlete, I come to understand as well. Yourself, you like a triathlon, long course triathlon. So I wanted to have a conversation. Here we are post the Olympics and Paralympics, and there's been a lot of conversation about the topic of fairness in sport and fairness in the women's category. And so I want to talk about that and get your expertise to unpack some of the science. And I said to myself, I really need someone who understands the science and can explain it to listeners. And I thought of you, and so I really appreciate your time. So I want to talk about that, the DSD athlete question that came up during the Olympics, and even the questions around the women's category and trans athletes. And I would be remiss if I didn't take the chance to get some of your expertise on menstruation and training of the female athlete in the menstrual cycle and the implications of that. But first, I will have introduced you properly in my pre-recorded preamble, but if you can just high level give our listeners some introduction in your expertise and perhaps your research agenda.
Yeah, sure. So maybe just briefly, I guess I've been working in sport for 20 years or so. As a researcher, I've gone through a kind of academic process of doing a PhD and then postdoctoral studies. I moved to Sweden in 2011. I'm from the UK, from down south in England. So I moved to Sweden in 2011, and I continue to work there now. So I work at Mid-Sweden University. And I started off as a postdoc there for a couple of years before I got, like, I think what you'd call tenure, like a permanent position. And now, yeah, as you said, I'm a full-time professor. So my background is really applied performance sport, I would say. I'm a very applied sports scientist. I've worked across quite a few different sports. I started off with a background myself in soccer, and my early studies were in team sports and soccer. And then I kind of became more expert in endurance sport. When I moved to Sweden, I started working with cross-country skiing and biathlon. So I lived up in Östersund, which is a winter hub for those endurance sports. So that was learning a lot of, I guess, new things around, well, culture, training philosophies, but also new sports and new types of athletes. I've always been very keen and careful to include women in my studies. I've got a physiology background, and if you read a lot of physiology papers, you'll read a section in the methods section that says that, women or females were excluded from this study due to their variations in cyclical hormones. And I always thought, well, that's a bit strange because then we won't know anything about women. So I guess that's something I've always been aware of. But it's only in recent years, probably the last 5 years or so, that I've really focused on looking more closely at the effects of the menstrual cycle, how that's impacting athletes, how it's impacting their training and performance. And I work kind of practically as a consultant as well with a company called Orico, as well as my kind of academic career. So yeah, lots of breadth to my applied sports science background, from team sports to endurance sports, male and female athletes, young all the way through to kind of top senior level. And then, like you said, like more of a recent specific focus on the female athlete and everything that entails, specifically around kind of different sex hormones compared to men. And that's naturally led a little bit to, this topic that you're talking about as well, in terms of DSD and trans women in sport. And me just being a passionate sportswoman myself and being a scientist and being very keen and aware of the importance to me of fairness and scientific fact.
Yes, thank you. And so, let's talk about this, because when the Olympics was going on, we had a discussion about there were some boxers that there was postulated that there was a DSD. We don't know all the detail, but I do know that there's a great deal of confusion among people on social media in the comment sections. And I realized that people really don't understand a lot about sport, how sport works, or the concept of fairness, and particularly know even less about the concept of DSD athletes. I mean, this was brought up during the Caster Semenya issue back in 2019, where that really started to gain a lot of awareness. But why don't we start there? If you can unpack for the listeners the concept of DSD, where biological sex may be inconsistent with phenotypic sex, and how that is connected to the element of fairness, particularly for the women's category. So what are the elements of DSD that are critical to this aspect of fairness?
Yeah, I think you summarized quite a lot of it really well in your kind of questioning. And I think the other thing, just to highlight that people, especially on social media, where there's a lot of opinions flying around, also seem to not know very much about is how sport is governed and how rules are made. And I mean, I know that when we discussed prior to this conversation, I'm really reluctant to focus particularly on athlete individuals. And I think it's definitely, relevant to examples and the examples that did arise at the Olympics and the Paralympics in boxing and on the track. And that there's no point to do that. But in my kind of mind, the athletes have failed by the sport governance of this kind of issue. A DSD, as you've alluded to there, it stands for differences in sex development. And as you kind of also mentioned, it will be some kind of atypical sex development during pregnancy, whereby the reproductive organs and the sex chromosomes are mismatched at birth with the visual genitalia. And what then can happen is that an XY baby or a baby with male chromosomes in each cell may appear to be a little girl, a female, due to the lack of any kind of visible male genitalia, so penis, and vice versa as well. So it means that at birth you can have a small baby being ascribed the wrong sex in terms of their invisible chromosomes, and that starts to manifest as that small person will then approach puberty, and in anybody or any kind of individual with XY chromosomes with this X-determining region on the Y chromosome, a male, they will then puberty start to initiate a kind of male sex development, and as it's more visible. So then you start to get a scenario where young people through puberty who were ascribed female at birth start to develop much more masculine physiques, more muscle mass, and then that kind of manifests throughout puberty. You've got somebody who's grown up as a little girl who might have even believed themselves for that whole time, then starts to have very masculine characteristics because of the fact that they have this increased, or they have internal testes and they have increased testosterone that's kind of having the effect of developing into a male. So it causes a very, like you said, difficult situation, which is a lot unknown and very, very different from a trans. And that's where we've had this situation in boxing where we've got two athletes competing in the female category. And like you said, we don't actually have all the facts because that data hasn't even been publicly published. So we're not even sure, what I'm not personally sure in any case of the results of those biological tests.
Right. And that's one of the issues, is that we don't have all the facts. I think when a governing body tests, a governing body can test for a myriad of things, whether it be for scheduled doping, random doping test, or any other element of fairness. The governing body, just out of confidentiality, won't make that information public for obvious reasons. The information can't be made public, and then there's the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is brought in to arbitrate, and so all of that brings up the complexities. But I think we learned in the Caster Semenya case that this can bring up some potential for the question of fairness. And I think in the Caster Semenya situation, we found out about the different possibilities that someone could have some androgen insensitivities and 5-alpha reductase deficiency. And in turn, we know how that ended up with world athletics. How is that going to develop? Do you have a scientific opinion on which way that may go? I know that world athletics has come down on a certain side. Are we headed to the evolving rules in that case of DSD athletes?
Yeah, I think the other thing, like, to add what you said about all the kind of difficulties, we have got a situation at the moment where there isn't like a systematic process for testing this. So that's one of the main problems, is that when a situation arises, such as the Caster Semenya case or that 400 meter Rio kind of podium situation, and the situation that we've just seen in boxing in Paris, for example, it causes like individual problems because it's what we can see on the TV and it's what the opposing nations might report or make claims against, and it's everybody watching, making claims against it. It gets very personal. So the problem that we've got is that the testing is not systematically required. So the fact that these tests were done previously appears to have been a previous opponent at a different competition before the Olympics took place, with a claim or a complaint of an opponent team against a particular athlete, and then that athlete being asked and required to take a test. So you can see that the problem becomes very personal and individual.
Right.
And that can't be the solution, because, that creates so many other issues. So I don't know what any federation is going to do going forwards. I can't predict that. All that I can do as a scientist is look at the things that are being published, and I don't lead on a lot of these projects. I'm kind of a collaborator and a colleague of other people who are kind of focused their expertise on this particular topic. This is not my main topic of research, but I understand it in that I can contribute to these kind of arguments and discussions and come with a perspective that I have as somebody who competes in sport as well, and part of the sporting environment.
Right.
But yeah, I think all that we can do is publish high quality, or this is our strategy in any case, publish high quality scientific information that both informs the general public and the social media kind of army, but more importantly policy and those organisations. So our hope is that that paper that we published, that we might come to and talk in a bit more detail, but paper that we published in Scandinavian Journal of Medical Science and Sport earlier this year, with Tommy Lundberg as the lead author. I was very much involved in that paper as well. But that's a kind of rebuttal or a critique of the International Olympic Committee's framework. And I think that that's a really important paper because it goes through step by step systematically and talks about all the flaws in the framework that they've published. They're trying to use to manage this difficult situation. It's
right.
so far away from what we should be doing that I think as scientists, we just have to come and offer something different. And like I said, we can always get into that in a bit more detail, but I can't speak for what any particular federation is going to do going forward. But I just hope that they read these papers, that they look at the actual science, because at the minute it is very politically driven and emotionally driven, and that's very problematic.
Yeah, let's get into that because the IOC announced their framework in, I believe it was 2021. And I remember back then I actually initially had a conversation with a scientist, Joanna Harper. You're probably familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a conversation with her in 2021 about those guidelines. Maybe we can dive into that. What is your impression of the guidelines. I think you spoke a little bit about, I think when many people, and I think even Joanna Harper agreed, that the guidelines sort of fell short. Do you think that this was robust enough coming from the IOC, from someone who's actually been an advisor to the IOC?
So let me tell you that in June of 2019, the IOC brought in a group of scientific advisors, and they had done this on an irregular basis since approximately 1990. I was asked to join this group in 2015, and they brought a group of us in, and their basic message that day was that they were going to prioritize human rights over science. And that led to the process of this set of guidelines coming out. And so it's very clear that they have made inclusion a priority. They have made a very concerted effort to champion two marginalized groups, transgender people and intersex people. And certainly, I think it's an important step that an organization as powerful and as public as the IOC has made this commitment to inclusion, and I certainly think that that's a positive thing. However, I do take issue with some of the details of the guidelines, and you mentioned two of them in particular. And if you'd like, we can talk about more details about the Section 5 and Section 6.
Everyone was sort of waiting for some robust, almost like a scientific paper that gave robust guidance, and it didn't really deliver that. So, perhaps you can unpack that for our listeners. Why is this an important issue that needs real robust scientific guidance as it relates to, protecting the women's category? Can you just offer some of the information that you and other scientists have put in your paper to try to solve or help with the solution?
Yeah, sure. So just like you said, in 2021, this framework, the IoT framework on feminine inclusion and non-discrimination, basis of gender identity and sex variations was not actually a scientific paper. That's on the Olympics website. So I'm assuming it was that one that you discussed with Joanna Harper. And then last year, in 2023, an actual scientific paper was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which is a classic journal in our field. And that was entitled Position Statement. So that's kind of a group of experts get together, they formulate this position statement. So it's kind of an opinion piece, supposedly completely based on science and evidence as well. And that was the position statement on this IOC framework on fairness, inclusion, non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sex variations. So that's the paper that we saw as a group, or, all of us saw kind of individually, read it and didn't think it was anywhere close enough to being up to scratch or up to standard to actually inform policy and help other federations. That's the main, or one of the main issues, is that the IOC they don't take any responsibility as an organization for leading on this. Rather, they kind of put out a lot of politicized ideology, and then the recommendation was that individual sports governing bodies, international governing bodies, would take this on themselves to come up with their own rules and guidelines. And the problem with that is, a lot of international governing bodies of various sports don't have very much money or resources to do these kind of projects very, very well. So it seems very strange that the IOC wouldn't pull together the resources, or maybe get input from all of the different federations and come up with something that actually suits world sport on a global level, rather than just kind of passing the buck to all of these federations. And that's why we're in the position where we are now, where all these different international federations, be it athletics, swimming, rowing, whatever, cycling, are all obliged to come up with their own solutions to the problem, which to me just seems absurd and really inefficient. But nevertheless, to sort of stick to the question, we tried to write a direct rebuttal to that paper, which is kind of like a rebuttal is something where, you know, a group of scientists get together and they don't agree with something that's been published, and they then are allowed to kind of write a scientific paper that is a statement, breaking down everything that you would feel is not correct. And we firstly, we wrote that paper and we submitted it. It has to go to the same journal where the original article was published in that case, and they rejected it. They were not prepared to enter into this discussion, clearly. And it is a difficult discussion and it is sensitive, but the peer reviews that we received on that paper were shockingly bad, in that none of it was based on any kind of science at all. So we reformulated the paper and wrote it as a standalone paper, and that's the one that we're talking about. So we published it. It's called the IOC Framework on Fairness, Inclusion and Non-Discrimination on the Basis of Gender Identity and Sex Variations Does Not Protect Fairness for Female Athletes. So that's kind of the title of the paper. It's the initial paper, and then trying to state that it does not protect fairness for female athletes. And when we say female athletes, we're talking about, you know, biologically born females. It's as simple as that. That's what the definition is. And what we do in that paper is we go step by step through each of the main claims in that position statement, and we provide a ton of evidence on each of the claims. And we're not doing this to make a point. Not everything in that paper to disagree with. There's a lot of things in that paper, such as inclusion, such as the importance of participation in sport at grassroots all the way up to the elite level. That's important for any individual, however they choose to identify. So there are a lot of things that, you know, in principle, we agree with the need for the IOC to do this work. We just don't agree with how they've actually gone about it and what their paper says. So just very briefly, I mean, I'm kind of skimming through the paper now, but there's subsections. So the first one, males and females are physically different and males have a category level athletic advantage. That's the point that we try to make in that section. And look, I'm not gonna go through every section, but hopefully we can link to it in the show notes or whatever. But point number 4, testosterone suppression post-puberty does not negate the male performance advantage. The point of that section is to highlight all of the evidence that shows that transitioning will not take away the advantage that a once born kind of male person had. So anybody who, and actually it's not only post-puberty that you start to get these advantages as males, like even younger boys start to show advantages. But the point is that just by taking medication to suppress testosterone, if you're transitioning and become a trans woman, that isn't going to then bring you down to a kind of female athlete level. And obviously these studies are very difficult to do, and we've really got a lot of case study kind of evidence, but all of these sections are steeped in kind of scientific biological data. Section number 5, just briefly, meaningful competition is not the same as fair competition. That one's a bit tricky because there's some strange kind of wording used in the original IOC framework position statement. But basically, just because, let's say that a trans woman is competing against female athletes in an event, just because they all run around about the same speed or around about the same time doesn't mean that competition is fair. That's just completely flawed as an argument. Section number 6, the framework's recommendations for implementation are unrealistic and unworkable in practice. They talk about, you know, taking things on a case-by-case basis, and they use an Australian federation as an example. And it's just not right to single out individual athletes in that way either. So there just does need to be a kind of systematic approach to this rather than just picking out cases as they arise, which we've seen is not a good way to deal with human beings, actually. Mm-hmm. And then, point number 7, case-by-case consideration is flawed in principle, unlikely to be practical or robust. And then the last two, I mean, just to kind of wrap this up, but I just think it was worth kind of highlighting how we go through this paper. And obviously people with more interest can go and read it. But the last two are around like female athletes. The first one, female athletes at all levels of sport deserve access to fair competition, because there's kind of arguments that this only needs to be brought in at the very top elite level once you become an Olympian, for example. But if you've got these issues going from kind of grassroots competitive sport, you're already putting other young girls or female athletes kind of at a disadvantage potentially, and that also, according to us, isn't fair. And then that final section there, female athletes are primary stakeholders and must be consulted. A lot of these policies are made, papers are written without even asking female athletes what they think or what they want, or what they think is right. And like it says there, they're the primary stakeholders. So, I mean, hopefully that's just a bit of an overview of what that paper looks like. And hopefully, just by scanning through the reference list, of which, if I have a look now, there's 85 kind of references in that paper. Like, it's very strongly, I would say, scientifically underpinned, which I think is the main problem of that IOC position statement.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I think pretty much summarized the difficulty to suggest that lowering your testosterone can effectively negate the performance differences. What would you say?
I was just going to sort of interject there that quite very recently, I think it was after we published this paper, I'm not too sure if it was after, but it's been very recent that a paper's come out from, there's a group over here in the UK who've published a paper where they've got some trans athletes and some female athletes. I don't know whether you've seen this paper, it's Hamilton et al. And they've kind of put them through various performance tests and basically concluded that trans women who have gone through kind of testosterone suppression post-puberty, because in their study are not outperforming the female cohort, then there's obviously no advantage. And I just think it's really important, a lay person picking up that paper and reading it, like how that paper got through review, I don't know, but I think it's also in BJSM, which is probably how. But, a lay person picking up that paper and reading it could easily be hoodwinked or convinced into that being proper science. But it's actually comparing like apples with pears. You can't just take a group of X and compare them with a group of Y and assume that they're matched. Like, a part of doing comparison studies are that, your two groups that you're comparing are matched. And that's basically impossible to do with a group of trans women and a group of like biological females. So I just kind of wanted to make that point, because the studies that kind of are being done are not always high quality, and we can't always rely on the methods and therefore the results and the conclusions of them. Yeah.
Understood. And so one of the common rebuttals is this, what I start to call the evoking of the Phelps principle. And the Phelps principle sort of sounds like this. All athletes have advantages, performance advantages. Why doesn't sport care about unfair advantages when it's Usain Bolt or Michael Phelps? So how would you answer that question as a sports scientist about all athletes have some sort of advantages?
Well, I think that's easy, to be honest. But obviously not everyone kind of sees it. I mean, competitive sport, and you obviously know, I would assume, kind of the answer to this, but I want to kind of make it clear for everyone listening who just won't necessarily have thought through these things, and that's fine. But competitive sport, by definition, aims to seek out the most talented. And the most talented are, a combination of those physical attributes, like you just said, with, Phelps having a long torso and huge hands and the rest of it, large feet. So there's physical kind of characteristics that you might be lucky enough to have. But it's not every individual who's got the best physique or the best physiological characteristics that's going to win that many gold medals. You also need to have the mental capacity You need to have tactics, you need to have technical abilities, you need to be coachable, you need to be dedicated and committed, you need to have support. There's so many things that we know successful athletes are required to have. But that's the whole point of, that's what we love about sport. That's what we love about competitive sport, elite sport, the Olympics, the World Championships. We want to see that Usain Bolt or that Michael Phelps or that Katie Ledecky. And that's what it's all about. But what we always make as a rebuttal is we call this the straw man argument. So you can't just take one example and say, just because, but that person's got these special talents. So why aren't we handicapping them? Why aren't we giving everybody else a head start against Michael Phelps? No, because within his category, and he's in a category of biological advantage. And that's the whole point of having male and female categories, because we know that men, if you take that bell curve of all men on the planet aged, let's say 18 to 40, they're going to perform better than all women on the planet. And that bell curve is going to be a long way to the right. And that's the whole point of it. And that's exactly the same as, we often use the analogy of having age groups. A 25-year-old man is not going to race 100 meters against an 8-year-old boy. We have to have age categories because there's a systematic advantage with age that, reaches a point where we peak, and then we get worse as we get older. So when you introduced me at the beginning, being somewhat successful, that's happened as I've got older. I haven't got worse. Other people have got worse more quickly. I've continued to get better, but I'm a masters athlete, and I'm a good masters athlete, but I couldn't beat the best senior elite female triathletes in the world. I don't think I ever could. But the point is that, as you get older, you go into your age groups, you have master categories, you can carry on competing in that specified and protected category. So being a woman and being a female athlete is a protected category. So that's why, there's no point to single out a Usain Bolt or a Michael Phelps or anybody else that stand out, because that's what sport is trying to identify. And the same, we often use the analogy as well of weight categories in combat sports, for example, or in rowing.
Yeah. So, when I hear that argument about Phelps, it sort of grates like fingernails down a blackboard, because across all of sport, we have sex or medically defined or biologically defined sex, impairments, para-athletes, impaired athletes, weight categories, lightweight, middleweight, heavyweight, and then like you mentioned, age. And that's really it. That is how we define fairness across all of sport with human bodies. Every advantage outside of those are fair game. And that makes sense, because in sport, you have to have the minimum number of categories. If you had a category for every attribute, right? People with big feet, people with long arms, height, people who live at altitude.
Female perspective, I have no problem to say that my breast size is 34F. I mean, that's hugely disadvantageous, in a sport where I have to run at the end. You know what I mean? So you would, right. You come up with all of these wild categories to make yourself a winner.
Yeah, we create categories when we need to, and we want to find Michael Phelps, Katie Ledecky, Shaquille O'Neal, Spud Webb. So
on this, I just was going to mention, because it's very very recent. I saw this yesterday. Did you see this? I mean, you said that you're in Boston, right? Yeah. You see the Boston Marathon?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting because the people around here have been talking about that, because the men's qualifying times are 30 minutes faster than the women's qualifying time, and they added the non-binary category, which are effectively just the women's qualifying times. That's interesting, because what that does, it gives if someone is a natal male and identifies as non-binary, they can now go down in qualifying time.
It's another definition of complete inequality. I mean, it's mind blowing how blatant it is, and how ignorant it. Like, I mean, I don't know anything. I'm not involved in this. I don't know anything about it. But I'm somebody that understands a lot about sport and a lot about male and female performance and a lot about this particular issue and all the complexities of it as well. So, I mean, I'm not privy to what discussions have been had around this behind the scenes and in the boardrooms, but, you know, the optics of this are horrific. And I can't, it's just unfathomable. So, no, I just thought it was worth bringing up because, you know, this is a day-to-day kind of occurrence now that's happening all around us. And I think it's important to continue to highlight the fact that this is absurd and not let this become normal, because that's not normal. It's exactly like you say, like the fact that the non-binary times are the same as the women's times is completely arbitrary in the first place.
Right.
And then the only people that gives an advantage to are trans women. And exactly like you said, any woman transitioning, so a trans man, a female transitioning, doesn't have a different time. So it's very bizarre. Just that it doesn't make any factual sense.
Yeah.
Basically.
And there was a lot of science that went into because when you look at Olympic marathon qualifying times and women's marathon qualifying time, that's a delta of 20 minutes, right? And then I think the original professor that helped them come up with that came up with the 30-minute delta for non-professionals. So the science that goes into that delta is solid. So people must look at that and understand the reality of that difference.
Yeah, I wonder where that professor was then, because like you say, like if the elite time is 20, I mean, we know that the depth of the field is smaller in women's, and as the level goes down, the difference gets larger. I mean, I'm actually quite surprised that it's half an hour across the board on age categories, but you know, nevertheless. But yeah, it's. I'm not arguing particularly. I don't know enough about how those standards have been developed and the science behind them, but certainly that non-binary standard is just a standout. Kind of absurdity is the only word that I can really think of, to be honest.
Yeah, but and I want to be sensitive to your time, so you know, how about we, if we can, go into the performance cycles of women and how that impacts their training cycles and racing cycles, if at all. I know you've done some work on this, and
I just to wrap up that first topic, I'd be a little bit careful to make sure, you know, and I know that this was down on the kind of discussion points before, but I do think it's important that, you know, I think that, and the group of us who wrote these papers as well, we think that inclusion in sport is very, very important. And we think that, you know, everybody should have the opportunity to be an athlete at any level. So I just want to kind of clarify that nothing that we've written and nothing that we think and nothing that we say is in any way trying to be excluding of any type of individual, regardless of who they are, what disability they might have, how they might choose to identify in terms of their gender. But like you've kind of alluded to with the language that you've been using, I mean, there's a difference between sex and gender. And I don't know the percentage of people that understand that difference, but I think it's very small and it's concerning. There is a difference between sex and gender, and you can't choose to socially identify some other way, whatever might be involved in that, in terms of how you feel and even how that might be affecting your mental health. These are all really valid scenarios for any given individual. And obviously that's the case even, you know, through development as a young child and all those kind of issues that might be occurring. But to me, they don't trump the structure that we already have in sport, and we have to find another solution. And we do talk about those in the papers as well, but there has to be another solution rather than just ignoring the new problems that we're creating with these kind of almost what I would call non-solutions that's going on at the moment. So that was the only thing, just to kind of wrap up on that topic, really, I think, that I was quite keen to say.
Right. Agreed. I mean, sports sort of rests on a pillar of fairness, whether it's, doping, anti-doping. For the last couple of years, we've had an argument about shoes, so-called super shoes. A lot of people think that they have an effect. And, and this is just another part of the fairness question in sport. It's a pillar of fairness. And if that pillar is compromised, then all of sport is compromised, right? So understood. And I will be looking at you and other scientists' work and continue to keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening here and report out. Thank you for that. So let's finish up, if we could, with the performance of female athletes in the training cycle. What can you tell us about how, whether you're an athlete or you're a coach, how should we approach the training cycle? And if we're looking at the 28-day cycle, how should we approach the different phases?
Yeah, good. And this is something I guess I spend a bit more of my kind of research time and my consultancy time working on as well. I think the first and probably most important thing that I can say, and if the listeners take anything away, it's that variation is huge here. Variation from one woman to the next in terms of how long her cycle is, whether she even has a cycle, whether she's using some kind of hormonal contraception, other contraception, how that menstrual cycle is going to manifest, how much blood she loses. It's so variable from one person to the next is one thing. And then also there's actually, a reasonable amount of variation within any given individual. So any one person from month to month, from year to year, over their lifespan, there's obviously a lot of change, but even through like an athletic career or... So I think we always come from this approach of tracking is key, first of all. Tracking is just basically a kind of systematic way to collect data and information. So it's exactly the same as if you're going to have some kind of a training diary. Like if you're a coach, the first thing that you want to know is what are your athletes doing? Firstly, you need to plan their training. What do they need to do? And then you need to kind of assess what are they actually doing? Are the two things matching up? In a lot of sports, a coach might be on site and seeing what they're doing. It's very prescribed. Endurance athletes might just get a program and they go off and they carry it out and then they report back and, they're using training peaks or some kind of diary system. So there's a constant clear communication about what's going on. And historically, that hasn't happened from a kind of menstrual cycle perspective for female athletes because we just haven't had the knowledge. It's been very taboo. Male coaches typically find it difficult and embarrassing. Women also might find it difficult and embarrassing to talk to male coaches, even female coaches, about this. So there's all these different barriers. We've done some work on identifying what those barriers are, and they're firstly knowledge. Knowledge is poor, and knowledge is poor because there's not much scientific evidence or good quality scientific evidence, especially in kind of applied sports scenarios. And then the interpersonal relationships are tricky, is a hard thing to talk about. And then another thing is those structural forums or platforms don't really exist. So now, there's plenty of menstrual cycle tracking apps. The consultancy company that I work with, Orico, we have our own one, which is kind of widely used across the world, Fitter Woman, which is great. There's other ones as well. And that'll allow you, and we've actually developed a product, I think it's the only one that exists, called Fitter Coach, where any fitter woman kind of tracking data, a coach can actually collect all of that information for their group of athletes. And then they can see all of the kind of cycle characteristics, the symptoms, when their athletes are due to their period. And we've used that with national soccer teams, for example, ahead of the Euros or the World Cup, to try to help the athletes manage what's gonna be coming up, because we've got algorithms there that run predictions and trends, so we can kind of say, okay, when you've got this match, this is likely to happen. So basically, in terms of the scientific evidence, there isn't any clear evidence that says that performance is better or more impaired at any particular phase of the cycle, any particular point in the cycle. That just doesn't exist on a large group level. It will exist on a kind of an individual level, but whether it's the same from month to month all the time, not necessarily. There's some kind of evidence, but a lot of the studies are poorly controlled, but there's some evidence to suggest that maybe your bigger strength and power training, and this is that typical idea or notion that we have, might be better done during the follicular phase when you've got that high estrogen and low progesterone in that first phase between, the start of the menstrual cycle and then that ovulation, so the first half of the cycle. But guessing where that phase is quite difficult. Like, everybody will have quite a different cycle duration. So you mentioned 28 days. The official definition of a eumenoric woman is 21 to 35 days. Lots and lots of athletes, especially high training load athletes at a high level, are not eumenoric. They miss their menstrual cycles. They might be oligomenoric or just blatantly amenorrheic. And then obviously lots of athletes are using hormonal contraception. And that's often as well, I would say, poorly and a bit too quickly prescribed from a young age to manage menstrual cycle symptoms. And that has kind of knock-on effects that we might come on to. But I just want to make it clear that there's no blanket kind of, this is the best way to train and this is when you're going to perform best. Any athlete is going to be able to, win their gold medal if that's the level that they're at any time across their cycle. So it's more about managing symptoms, managing individual expectations, managing the psychology and the mindset, managing the communication and the discussions, and just improving knowledge and thinking about, the different things that you can do when you might need to take iron supplementation, for example, what kind of period products are going to be useful or required. There's lots of things to have in mind that are more practical. So I would say that's a bit of a kind of summary.
During that week, during the week of menstruation, if let's say you were coaching an athlete, would you suggest that they plan their race scheduling around it, or is it still highly individualized?
I think it's a bit individual. Like some athletes, obviously, some events you're completely out of control of. Like the Olympic Games, you can't choose when that event is going to sit, or a championships event or something. If you can choose your schedule, then sure. But I think that should be done. You need to monitor your cycles for some time, a few months at least. That's why the monitoring and building up that database is so important. So, start building up a database so that you can get some predictions of what's happening in the future, but also you've then got a database of how you feel and when you are affected and how heavy your bleeding is. Like, I personally have one day, and it's not even necessarily it's not a 24-hour period. It's typically sort of 12 hours. So I can be lucky in that, lucky in a way, if that happens at the night time, it kind of doesn't affect what you're doing in the daytime, but then it does affect your sleep. But if it kind of occurs in the daytime, and that for me varies when I start to get my period and when the heaviest kind of 12-hour block will be.
Right.
Whereas I've got other girlfriends that I'll talk to and they come on exactly the same time of day every single cycle. So even those kind of things are really variable. But the point is, I'm a triathlete, or that's my sport. So swimming on that day of like my heaviest period, which has got worse over time, it's kind of a bit awkward, or it's a bit worrying, or it's like you don't want to be in the pool if there's that kind of feeling that you're going to leak blood. I mean, and all these things people aren't really talking about, or even having this conversation, like saying some kind of words that take people aback. So it might be that, like a sea swim for me, I live right on the sea, like maybe that's a better option, or I just schedule it so that I'm not swimming in the pool on that heaviest day where I can have those kind of worries and it's quite easy to switch around. Other kind of power athletes, you do have kind of physical changes, obviously, in your kind of joint laxity and in your muscle function. A friend of mine is a strength and conditioning coach for one of our very good 100-meter runners. And I think she's actually openly talked publicly as well about kind of sometimes needing to monitor her, modify her heavy strength training sessions if she's got quite a sore back in those premenstrual days. She doesn't want to do some of her Olympic lifting or some of her real heavy weight sessions, strength and power sessions. So that's where, every scenario I would say is somewhat case by case. Not to the point where if you're a soccer coach or a team sport coach of 20 athletes and you've got all this kind of huge logistical nightmare of trying to manage every single individual, but we will do things with elite soccer clubs where we'll have kind of pockets of athletes, or we'll try to individualize it or get them in doing different programs on different days. It just takes, more and more female sports clubs where they have the capacity are kind of employing kind of a female health expert, even if it's just kind of a part-time role, but to manage these kind of things, to really get the most out of their female athletes around all of these factors. Right. But it's not rocket science, and it's not make or break, but it's just like nutrition, or it's like your recovery. It's another thing that you need to be on top of.
These are things that natal women have to deal with that I don't have to deal with, or male athletes have to deal with, right? And this sort of gets lost in the conversation. I think it probably should be talked about more. The physiologist Stacy Sims wrote that book back in 2016 called Roar, and I read that book and I said, wow, her tagline was "Women are not small men," and then she started talking about how the science is skewed towards men, and there's not a lot of science about it for women. And so, and that's when it really got on my radar screen that, I really should be talking with my female athletes about this. And like you said, sometimes they don't want to touch it. Other women do want to touch it, and just trying to look at it as another variable that they can use to try to dial into their performance. Is there a contraception effect?
Yeah, again, at that kind of high large group effect level, not really. I don't know whether you saw, or kind of the listeners would have seen, in, I think it was 2021, a couple of systematic reviews and meta-analyses came out with Kirsty Elliott-Sale and Kerry McGawley on the first authors, respectively. One was about menstrual cycle phases and performance, what we already talked about, and the other one was about hormonal contraceptive use and kind of performance. And in that systematic review and meta-analysis, there weren't any kind of significant effects of hormonal contraceptive use on performance. They did find a sort of trivial, so that just means that, there might be some sort of effect whereby hormonal contraceptive use is going to be detrimental for performance compared to a natural menstrual cycler. But there was so much variation across the different studies. So, I'm sure you all know, but just for the listeners, a systematic review and meta-analysis just takes kind of all the papers that are available, all the research that's available, and pulls it and tries to come out with a kind of overall consensus. But what they do talk about in both of those papers actually is how quite poor a lot of the studies have been historically, because we haven't had the funding to do these studies really well. They're actually very time consuming, because you really ought to do them over a series of menstrual cycles or hormonal contraceptive use cycles. There's so many different types of pill. If you use an oral contraceptive pill with different chemical makeups and different hormonal kind of exogenous hormonal makeups. So all those things have not really been standardized. You need huge amounts of women to find a group of a particular hormonal contraception that you can then kind of track over time. And you need really good adherence to that sort of study as well. So they're very, very difficult to do well in practice. So yeah, there's lots of variation. There might be some trivial effect. But then the other thing that we do know about all contraceptive or hormonal contraception is that it might lead to kind of increased systemic or chronic inflammation. And there are like physiological studies showing that, and that doesn't have to be in athlete cohorts of kind of elevated CRP and other measures of inflammation. And we know that a kind of chronic inflammation is going to cause cellular damage. It decreases kind of immune function or suppresses immune function. it inhibits some training adaptations, it inhibits recovery and all those kind of things. So at a physiological level, it could well be that kind of chronic use is not helping.
Right.
But what we have to remember as well, I mean, it's a medication. So should we anyway, it's been so normalized to take a 15, 16-year-old who goes into her GP, her medical practitioner, and saying, oh, I'm struggling really badly with menstrual cramps and I feel like I've got a lot of like symptoms, premenstrual symptoms, and without very much alternative whatsoever, these young girls are being put on a contraceptive pill from a very young age. They then, as they develop as athletes, they've got no idea if they would have had regular menstrual cycles. They don't know anything about their natural estrogen. Their bone health can be affected. Their fertility could be at risk. So, I mean, for me, I really struggle with that situation. And we see that a lot, particularly in sport, to manage those symptoms and also to manipulate periods, like you were saying, or manipulate that bleeding so that it doesn't occur when we might have an important competition.
Right.
So I just think that we really need to think twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times before just blindly doing these kind of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it's so much to think about here. And wow, I mean, we really covered some ground, and a couple of these things that we touched on, you could have its own hour conversation. So, but I'm glad I got some time on your calendar to be able to do this. I really appreciate it. How can people follow you online?
Well, I've just kind of signed. I think I've had a LinkedIn profile for quite a while, but I don't use it. I'm a LinkedIn learner, so I've got quite a distinctive name. So Kerry McGawley. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram, which is probably a bit more personal. And now I'm learning LinkedIn. But otherwise, I've got my Mid Sweden University email address. So maybe you can share that in your notes if anyone's got anything pertinent to reach out about. And then you kind of see, I guess, our publications as well on something like a platform like ResearchGate or PubMed.
Yeah. And then if you go follow you on Instagram, we can see all of your triathlon accolades. Well, what do you got coming up next? Anything big?
Well, I'm going to do the Ibiza T100 race, which is a week from this weekend. So they've got the pro race on the Saturday and then age group race on the Sunday. But I've currently got a calf injury. I've never been injured before, so it's killing me. I can't actually run at the moment, so we'll see. And then the Taupo 70.3 Worlds are at the end of the year in December, so we'll see if I can kind of get ready for that. So,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll be watching, see what you do. Great.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks again for this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on in the chat. I mean, it was, just for me, like off it, like it was such a nice chat to have with you. You're obviously very, very well read and well informed, and have a clear passion around sport. And so it was a really nice conversation for me to have as well with you.
My thanks to Professor Kerry McGawley. You can find her links in the show notes to her social media presence, as well as her bio, as well as her recent co-authored paper. Back in 2019, I predicted that this conversation would be one of the biggest issues in all of sport. And here we are in 2024, and I think that proved to be true. In 2022 and 2023, World Aquatics and World Athletics released their revised and refactored requirements. They govern international swimming and international track and field, respectively. The new requirements read that they are protecting the women's category and making some accommodations for other athletes accordingly with categorization. We'll have to watch and see where other governing bodies fall over the next few years as they wrestle with this question. And as it relates to high contact and combat sports, well, there's absolutely no question about it. This is a measure 9 times, cut once type of decision when there's safety risks and liability involved. So let's hope that they are carefully weighing all of their decisions. To close out, One of the things that I think about in the history of humanity or human ancestors, someone at some point in time, an ancestor of humans drew some line perhaps in the dirt, and then drew another line in the dirt somewhere farther off. That ancestor of humans looked at their peers and said, I'll race you from this line to that line in whatever language or dialect they were using. I sometimes wish I can get into a time machine and go back to that point in history whenever it occurred, because that was the birth of the racer and perhaps the birth of sport. And sport is one of the greatest, most important, and unique concepts ever created by humanity. And so that's why we hear people speaking so passionately on all sides of the issue on how to include as many people as possible and how to make sport as fair as possible. We now have over 100 years of organized competitive sport and sport science to rely on. I recall being in one of my coaching training courses, and it was on anti-doping. The instructor was talking about how the doping control officer procures an A sample and a B sample. And I asked a question. I said, how do you determine that the athlete gives you an actual sample from their own body? She said the doping control officer must, and I'll never forget this, quote, see the fluid leave the body. What that means is the doping control officer has to literally watch the urine come out of the body's opening and watch the fluid go into a receptacle. That just gives you one example of how important fairness is to sport. We've had debates over the years in regards to so-called swimsuits, super swimsuits. I think one was called a Speedo laser swimsuit that was eventually banned over the last few years. Like I said on the podcast, we had arguments about so-called super shoes, which people thought gave an unfair advantage. And you remember the circumstance with the Blade runner, Oster Pistorius, who ran in the Olympics with his prosthetic blades. And the governing body initially thought, we think those pieces of equipment that you have might give you an unfair advantage. I think he was eventually allowed to run. All of this is happening because when you decide to particularly become a racer, and you decide you're going to devote your entire life from starting at one line or wall and going to some other line or wall and trying to traverse the distance in between in the shortest time possible, then you're spending your life trying to, as we saw in the Olympics, separate yourself from a competitor by tenths of seconds, even thousands of seconds. We saw the 100-meter men's track and field final. The first and second place finishers were separated by a time faster than a human can blink. With racers, first place finisher and an 8th place finisher, whether it be track and field or swimming, as we've seen, can be separated by tenths of seconds, thousands of seconds. So even the slightest advantage, insofar that it may be unfair, would have a pretty substantial impact on an outcome. And this is the reason why whenever we have questions of any sort of element of unfair advantage, Whether or not an athlete, quote unquote, lost in the past is irrelevant, because the margin of victory between first place and even 10th place is often small, and therefore sport necessarily has to be forward-looking. Thank you for listening. Next up, as always, when I end a season, I will follow with my best of episode, which allows me to take a look back at the 5 most downloaded episodes of the season. I will provide a clip and updated commentary on those 5 episodes, and then we'll start editing and recording for season 7. Thanks again.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.